Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tim. This is another Real Ideal Gear review, and today we're looking at a legend, the GW9400, the Rangeman. This is a fantastic watch, loaded with features, tough as nails. A lot of things I love about this watch, and there's a few things I'm not a huge fan of. And so we're going to go through some of those things. We'll get to those later on in the video. But we're going to go through the 5 things we typically go through: size, fitment, finish, accuracy, legibility, and light, with some conclusions and practical applications at the end. So let's start off with the size of the watch. It is 53.5 millimeters across in diameter, 18.2 millimeters high off the wrist, which gives it a chunkiness factor of 2.9. Now, for comparison, this watch, when you compare it to the Mudman, which has a, let's see here, that one is 52.7 millimeters across and 14.8 millimeters high off the wrist. The chunkiness factor on that watch is 3.56. 3.56 to me is kind of perceptively not nearly as chunky. Actually, it feels a little bit more well proportioned. When you get into a watch like this, 2.9, 2.7, 2.8, into the high twos, it really does start to feel like a chunky watch on the wrist. It doesn't have quite enough width to it when it comes to the amount of height that comes off the wrist. So really it's a perception of chunkiness, not an actual objective, this is a chunky watch and this isn't. This is what I use to kind of judge the standard of what a chunky watch might or might not look like on my wrist. Now I have kind of an above average size wrist, so those are kind of the numbers that I go by. Anything about 3.4, maybe 3.3 and higher typically doesn't feel as chunky as anything below 3.3. Then it really starts to feel like a chunky watch on the wrist. And then for me, I have to pay a little bit closer attention as to what watch I'm wearing, the conditions that I'm wearing it. Do I really want this watch that's chunkier to be snagged on things because it's taller off the wrist, that kind of thing? Or does it wobble around on my wrist because it's so top heavy? Those are all the things I start to think about more when that chunky factor starts to go up. Now, the size of the buttons on this watch, I really like the size. I love the look. I love the texturing on here. Easy fix when it comes to changing things on here. I really like this. Also, the 6 o'clock light button on here, the angle of actuation on here is about 45 degrees, which is perfect for me. When I was looking at the Mudman, it was more like 30 degrees and it was coming more horizontal. I'm not a fan of that. I really like the angle for this light button on here. I can press it easily with this hand. It's not a big deal at all. And I love the texturing on these buttons as well. I'm not 100% sure if these are aluminum buttons or not, but the texturing on here sure feels like it. And there's no doubt that when I put my finger on the button, that I'm actually touching the button. I'm not touching another piece of plastic like, well, is that the button or is that one of the button guards kind of a thing? So I really like that. As far as the fitment goes, kind of the typical Casio fit. You have the spacing in between here. I'm not a fan of that. I just think they're just a little too far apart. So same complaint as I've had with all Casios. On the inside, though, you have the ratcheting keeper system. That's my term for it. But that allows the keeper to kind of basically stay in one place because there's these ridges that the keeper has to maneuver over in order for it to move. Just makes it more difficult for the keeper to move around. So I really like that system on here as well. Also, there's a little bit of a wedge at the very end of the strap right here. And so that just keeps the keeper from sliding all the way off and this thing popping up in the air. So to me, this whole strap system I think is really great. It's not the thickest strap that's out there, but I've never had a problem with a G-Shock strap broken or breaking or cracking. I suppose over time that might be the case. I know that the Mudman is much thicker than this. At the same time, it's stiffer, which also means it doesn't contour around the wrist as well for smaller wristed people. I'm a slightly above average size wrist, so it doesn't really matter to me either way. But if you're in that lower, smaller size wrist category, I think this watch is going to fit you much better because the strap is much more flexible. Now, something this one doesn't have is kind of those comfort wedges in here. They kind of also make the watch feel like it's a little bit more contoured around the wrist. The finish of this watch, kind of your typical dark gray resin finish case, resin finish on the strap itself. Not a lot to write home about, but it does have a stainless steel keeper, stainless steel twin buckle system right here, which I think is really helpful. I think what it does is it just makes the failure rate a little bit less because it spreads the stress out a little bit more. rather than all pressure. If you have the watch catch on something, all being on one particular pin, you have it on 2 pins, divided by 2. It reduces the overall stress in that particular area. I love the finish of the buttons on here. Again, the different colors on here are fantastic. You have the aluminum looking buttons. You have a little bit of red on the 3 o'clock position. You also have some red text in and around the display. I just think the overall look of this watch is very good. Very Casio G-Shock looking with just a little splash of color in there. The finish is fantastic. So let's take a look at the display. Now, when we look at the display, obviously, for me, the time display is not big enough. This is actually not proportionally, the same basic size as the Casio Square. And when you put the Casio Square up next to this watch, there is just no comparison. The Casio Square is a much smaller case size. And to have the same size time display on there, to me, is just irresponsible use of space as far as the display goes. You basically have segmented the display into 4 parts. You have the round multi-purpose dial in the upper left. You have a top segment, a middle segment, in the top half actually. And then you have the bottom half, which is the time, which also means the legibility is going to suffer as a result. Now, I do like the display that you have options for. At the very top, you can display the day of the week or the barometric trend. Underneath that, you have the month and the date. That's always there. To the left of that, you have the multi-purpose wheel. There's a lot of things that this thing can do. For instance, when it comes to the alarm or the world time or the barometric pressure, that changes from just a running seconds, which is totally useless, to something that actually shows you what's going on. As far as like the world time goes, it tells you what your home time is and what the world time is. Now, you have to have my glasses on for me to read that, but at least it tells me something other than the running seconds, which is already there in the digital form. So overall, I'm not a huge fan of the display. I think it's too segmented. The legibility suffers as a result of it, but I do love the overall look and the finish of this watch. It looks great. It's a little chunky, but that's the G-Shock look, isn't it? I mean, it just looks really tough. What about the accuracy of this watch? Typical Casio quartz accuracy, nothing to write home about. What runs this, though, is the Tough Solar. You don't ever have to worry about the battery change. Just keep this out in the sunlight. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the Tough Solar and the length of batteries, if you turn the power save function on, and let's just say you throw this in the drawer for months on end, you can run this watch for 26 months on the power save mode. 26 months, over 2 years' time. Now, if you're using this watch for whatever reason in the dark, but you charged it up fully to start with and you end up using this watch in the dark, kind of the typical use of the different functions, you can run this watch for 6 months under normal use conditions, which is also really impressive. So whether you store it in a drawer for 26 months or you're a vampire and you only work at night and you charge it up once, you can use it for 6 months straight. It's a great longevity as far as use goes with the Tough Solar charging. We've talked about legibility a little already. The segmented display really does make things suffer as far as the overall size of the displays. So reading the time, I can read it without my glasses, not a problem whatsoever. But relatively speaking, the size of this watch, it should be bigger. This actually reminds me of the GW2900. And it's like, man, so many opportunities, and it's just squandered with all kinds of inefficiencies in engineering and placement of information in the display. I love the clarity of the display on this one, and this one doesn't seem to have the same haziness that the Mudman does, the GW9500. The GW9500, the Mudman, sometimes at certain angles it looks a little hazy, and I think that has to do with the dual layer LCD display that you have the compass layer on top of the time display, and at certain angles it just looks kind of hazy. This watch doesn't have that because it doesn't have the dual layer to it, so that's great. The light on this is outstanding. When you press the light button on here, just a great overall distribution of light. It's very even. There's no dead spots on the display. I love the light on this watch. And I think with the automatic light function, which by the way, you turn that on by holding down the light button until you see the LT show up on the display. That means automatic light, which also means that when you roll your wrist in low light or no light conditions, it automatically turns the light on when it gets up to the reading position. Now, your spouse will probably tell you that when you get into bed and you have the automatic light function on and you turn the wrist and it keeps flashing light in her direction or his direction, and they may say something like, turn off that automatic light. But I think it's a great function. I think the light is very effective on this watch, and really there's no issues as far as legibility goes with the light. Now this is a Casio, 200 meters of water resistance. You have a 10 meter drop or shock resistance. And in this case, you have a tough solar that basically you don't have to worry about batteries whatsoever. So this watch really is about as low maintenance as you're going to get. And with all the features that are added into this to make this watch tougher, the crystal protection with the crystal guards here at the top, you really have a low maintenance, very effective watch. Some practical uses for the Rangeman include manual labor type things. Like for me, it's lawn maintenance work. It could be rock work. It could be tree work, cutting down trees, processing lumber, those kinds of things. Outdoor work, outdoor stuff. It could be not just work, but it could be outdoor enjoyment. It could be hiking, camping, rock climbing, mountaineering. With the altimeter, barometer, compass, and temperature, great for mountaineering, great for hiking, great for hunting. You have 200 meters of water resistance, so basically all weather conditions, this thing is going to work. You've also got tough solar. So even if your battery is for other Casio watches, maybe you're using a battery watch, you don't know when the battery is going to go out. With this one, it's always charging. And you get 6 months of use out of this, even if you haven't charged it for a while and it's only been a couple of months. This watch is going to be useful for 2 or 3 more months. So I have no reservations at all in using this watch for my lawn business. And again, I'm going to use this watch when I'm cutting wood. I'm going to use this watch for splitting firewood. I'm going to use this watch when I'm doing shrub work, tree work, rock work. I have no reservations about this watch whatsoever. Now this watch also has something else to it. It has the ABC, altimeter, barometer, compass, and temperature. So if you're an outdoorsman, this will be very helpful for you. You can also go between the 12 and 24-hour modes. And then the basic functions on this watch go from world time to stopwatch to timer. You have the different alarms along with snooze. You also have sunrise and sunset. So for those of you that are hunters out there like me, the half an hour before sunrise, the half an hour after sunset are your legal hunting hours. And so this watch is really great for that. To do that though, you have to add or enter in your latitude and longitude. Then you also have a recall so that you can basically screenshot the information that's on the screen and keep that for a later date. That's really helpful when it comes to, in my experience, mountaineering. When you want to get to a certain altitude and you get a certain altitude, maybe it's foggy out or there's a snowstorm or whatever, you can search at that altitude and never leave the altitude and move kind of horizontally on the mountainside and have a better chance of finding things rather than not knowing what your altitude is and traveling up and down and side to side of the mountain trying to find something in the fog. Believe me, knowing what your altitude is a huge help when it comes to those circumstances. Then you also have the automatic or the manual atomic timekeeping setting mode. On top of all that, you have a power save mode that you can set, that you can also then, when the watch is not being used and it's in a dark setting, shut everything down to maintain the juice of the battery for as long as possible, which is another great feature. So overall score for this watch is a 9.7 out of 10. I really like this watch. There's a few things I don't. The legibility takes the biggest hit out of all of these. Takes the biggest chunk out of this. And really the rest of this watch I actually really like. If the legibility issue was resolved in this watch, this could be a 10 out of 10, no problem whatsoever. So put the comments down below what you think of this watch. Also check out my webpage, realidealgear.com, for any reviewed gear, watches, knives, flashlights. Check it all out. Good prices on reviewed gear. Sometimes I have new gear. I think I've got a couple of knives that are brand new in the box that the manufacturer, Revo Knives, they don't have these in stock, or they didn't have them in stock the last time I checked. So check those things out, realidealgear.com, for any used watches, knives, or flashlights. And sometimes new stuff will show up there as well. So there you go. My name is Tim. This has been another Real Ideal Gear review. We'll catch you guys next time. Now, what about legibility? We've already talked a little bit about legibility. The dial suffers as a result of all the different segments that are here. So let's talk about legibility. Now, we've already talked about